I may be late to the party on this one, but we're here now, so let's talk about probably my most anticipated release for next year. That being the remake to Resident Evil 4. So overall, what were my thoughts on the reveal? Yeah, I'm excited for it. Like, really excited for it. Not only because it's more Resident Evil, but it's a remake to one of the most influential games ever made. So that puts the remake in a very interesting position, thus feeding my interest. Capcom is tasked with remaking a beloved game, and from all the marketing I've looked at, Capcom wants to take this remake in a very different direction. From tone to atmosphere, whilst also updating a lot of the character designs to fit this new vision for the game. For example, the villagers look a lot more threatening this time around, having a more infected look to their designs. The same with the cultists. It seems that the game is taking a more serious tone similar to the last couple of games in the series. Now, I have seen a lot of people express their concerns about this idea because the tone of the 2005 game was completely different and was something that gave RE4 its unique identity within the franchise. If I was to present to you my feelings towards the original 2000 game right now, I like it. I like it a lot. For the gameplay and atmosphere. The loop of the gameplay was really fun and satisfying. The atmosphere, whilst different from the RE1 remake, still gave that feeling of isolation, tension and dread. The art direction also is worthy of praise too. RE4, for a 2005 game, is absolutely gorgeous, even at the low resolution of the GameCube release. Overall, the gameplay, look and feel of the game is why I find myself going back to the game even though I have just recently finished it at the beginning of this year. Yes, I'm not kidding, this year, or the beginning of this year, was the first time I had ever fully finished this game. In terms of the story and characters though, I can't say the same. Now look, I don't hate RE4's story, like, at all. It's just I found it pretty forgettable, and the majority of the characters are either underdeveloped or don't get enough screen time. Leon and Louis, or Louise, however you fucking say it, are the only characters I genuinely care about. The problem with Louis, he doesn't get enough screen time, which was strange to me when playing through it for the first time, because if you actually look into the backstory of the game, he's actually a really integral part of the backstory prior to the events of the current game. The other characters of the game like Krauser, Salazar and Sadler I could care less for because the writing for them didn't give me a good enough reason or an incentive to want to become invested. A character like Ashley Graham only just suffers from being useless in terms of gameplay rather than a terribly written character. If they managed to find a way to make her more useful during gameplay, then I think most of my problems with her character would be addressed. The story of RE4 just needs some more depth because whilst the original story wasn't bad per se, it didn't stand out as much as, let's say, Resident Evil 2 Remake or Resident Evil Village, mainly because with those games' stories, I liked how they were structured. There was a lot of intrigue there, especially when it came to the backstory. That to me, alongside the main stories, was the real strength for those games. I'd like the remake to update the story to have more backstory to the village, how Las Plagas was created, what's the deal with Salazar, and most importantly, more insight on Krauser and his relationship with Leon, because in the original game, it makes a big deal about their history, but they only tell us that instead of showing us. You could argue that them just telling us adds a little bit of mystery to the whole backstory, but I'm more of a show don't tell kind of guy. I like to see the events that have transpired. Doing my research, it turns out that the script for the game was rushed, with Capcom giving director Shinji Mikami only 3 weeks to develop a script, and it really shows. The last section of the game, The Island, grinds the game to an absolute halt, becoming more of an action game instead of a pseudo-survival horror that we were playing through hours before, and the climax overall felt a little underwhelming. It still had that, classic, optimistic Resident Evil ending. Final boss fight just, and that's something to note too. The boss fights are something I feel can be improved upon as well. The way they're designed just made them pretty bland and forgettable. Capcom are clearly capable of making good boss fights, because in the RE3 remake, despite being a mediocre game, had some incredible boss fights, and the same goes for Village. If the boss fights are something to be improved upon, then I will be extremely happy. Capcom, I have seen you create some amazing boss fights in a lot of your games. You have an opportunity here. Another problem I have was the dynamic difficulty of the game. Whilst impressive for the time due to its concept, its execution really makes some of the gameplay really inconsistent and cheap at times. Now, that's not to say I hate difficult games. I like a lot of difficult games, specifically FromSoft games, because most of the time when you die in their games, it's down to poor choices from you as a player rather than a design flaw. The dynamic difficulty of Resident Evil 4 is extremely flawed and something that I would prefer to see be removed in favour for something else. I would much prefer it if they brought back the difficulty of Resident Evil 2 Remake, where they allowed for ink ribbon saving, whilst also allowing you to be a hell of a lot more vulnerable compared to other difficulties. I dislike the dynamic difficulty because it essentially punishes you for being good at the game, to the point where the system throws a curveball at you and the difficulty is kicked up to 11, where it's extremely unbalanced, and the only way to mitigate that is to die at least 3 times on purpose, which is just a real hindrance on the game's overall pacing. And lastly, for things I want them to add or improve on, I want the developers to somehow integrate the cancelled content of one of the many versions of Resident Evil 4, one of which was named Resident Evil 3.5, or most noticeably, as it's known in the community, the Hookman version. What this cancelled version for Resident Evil 4 was, it was basically a psychological survival horror game with paranormal elements. This version felt more faithful to the first remake in the series in terms of atmosphere, even if the genres have shifted gears. If you take a look at the gameplay here, you'll notice the atmosphere and tone is very similar to Resident Evil 1 Remake. There was a mysterious fog that ambushes Leon, and if caught, would change some parts of how the game played. And lastly, there was the Hookman himself. There's not a lot of history with this character, but his design and presence in this demo has become something that the RE community has become very fond of. Now, I would absolutely love it if Capcom finds a way to integrate these enemies into this new remake of RE4. In the story of the original Resident Evil 4, Leon becomes infected with Las Plagas, and there is a cutscene in which Leon has a nightmare about becoming fully infected with the virus. They could expand on this cutscene and make it an actual gameplay segment. As an idea, and how we could see them integrate 3.5 into the game, what if, when after Leon faints, he runs through a messed up version of the RPD building, but this time the rooms are contorted and changed, with a fog that slowly consumes the place and pursues Leon. This idea of the fog could symbolise the virus slowly taking over his body, because for me, one of the weirdest decisions in the game was that Leon got infected and that was it. You only had about 2 cutscenes where they brought that whole thing into the forefront. They never really made a big deal about him being infected. As for the Hookman, they could find a way to include the character in this nightmare sequence, or make him a completely new character for the Village segment. You could make him a pursuer, much like Mr. X, though I would actually kind of like the chainsaw guy as well, so we'll just have to see how that plays out. And lastly, they need more puzzles. Please Capcom, add more puzzles in this remake. I'm not the biggest fan of puzzles myself, but Resident Evil strikes that fine balance for me. A lot of the puzzles in these games are fun, and I would really like it if they add more puzzles in this remake, because the original Resident Evil 4 lacked a lot of puzzles, and that was one thing I have seen a lot of people basically express their concerns about. So if they could add more puzzles into the remake, that would be fantastic. Now let's shift the subject a bit and move on to more positive things and talk about things that I don't want them to change. One of my absolute favourite parts of RE4's gameplay was its inventory system, or the attaché system. What made this inventory system so much fun is that it was basically a constant puzzle for you to solve, since you need to move things around in order to fit more weapons, attachments, ammo and health items into your case. I would like them to expand on this, but we don't really know what their intentions are with this, so we're just going to have to wait. However, they did actually bring this concept back into Resident Evil Village, though if I was to be completely honest, I preferred RE4 versions there over Villages. I don't know, there was something there that just felt very off to me. The side activities like target practice should absolutely stay, but expand more on its ideas. Capcom should definitely keep the Ada campaigns and find a way to integrate them into the story without them being its own separate mode. Speaking of modes, the Mercenaries mode. Oh my fucking god, Capcom, I swear, if you do not have the Mercenaries mode in this remake, I will lose my goddamn mind, because the Mercenaries mode in the original RE4 was incredible. The reason why I say this is because for some mind-boggling reason, Capcom decided to remove the Mercenaries mode from the RE3 remake and replaced it with a standalone multiplayer component that barely anyone played when it was released. Look, the remake of 3 wasn't bad, but in comparison to the original game, it lacked a lot of areas, and the fact they had cut a lot of those areas, many of which were iconic part of the original game, made the remake feel a lot more empty, and they could have done so much more with this, like expanding on those memorable parts. Capcom taking stuff out from the original game is something that has me worried, because I really don't want to see any amount of content that was prominent in the original game to be removed in favour for something worse. Now, the relieving part here is that 4's remake is being made by the same developers of RE2 Remake and Devil May Cry 5. In terms of who developed RE3 Remake, that was made by a completely different team, so for those who are worried about who's making it, hopefully this helps, though Capcom could easily mess this up by taking things out. This remake is what I believe to be a second chance for Resident Evil 4 in giving the developers the opportunity to improve on the game's original faults and expand on what made RE4 such a fun game all those years ago for a modern audience, whilst also potentially adding some legacy elements such as the Hookman that I mentioned. They have a chance to improve the story, characters, levels, bosses and difficulty system, which is why I'm kind of hyped for this. However, with Capcom treating this new remake as a reimagining of the original game and being pretty vague with what their intentions are, it does have long-time art fans of RE4 worried about what is being changed. The last thing I want for this game is to be another Resident Evil 3 remake, and that it ended up being an inferior product. I do hope that Capcom and the writers really stay true to what people liked about the original game, whilst also doing something different to bring in new people whilst keeping long-time fans happy. As much as I do have problems with the original version, the over-the-top playful nature of the game is an important part of the game's identity, even if I'm not always in favour of it at times. Capcom, I'm begging you, please do not mess this remake up. I can forgive RE3 Remake, but Resident Evil 4 has played such an integral part in the gaming industry. If it wasn't for RE4, we wouldn't have had an amazing franchise like Dead Space. Dead Space was inspired by RE4, so I would really like it if they just didn't fuck this up. So I'm begging you, Capcom, don't fuck this up. Just improve on some of the faults of the original and expand on the stuff that people liked about the game, and just add some new things too. Hell, I would fucking love it if we got some more wacky costumes. Like, you know, remember the costumes in the original game? Keep that shit in it. I do not want to see any of that stuff removed. If you liked what I had, what I had to say in this video, like it, comment on it, and if you really want to see some more content because you're interested in what I have to say about other things, then consider subscribing and turn on that bell notification. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, can't wait for RE4 Remake.